Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon. At the tea, I was walking around asking everybody I came across what it was they wanted to hear, and I regret to say most of them said gossip and scandal, which they knew not going to hear any of that. But people are going to talk personally about how they came into anthropology, and how they made their way and some of the things that they found out. And I hope that cumulatively some sort of collective biography of a generation will be told. And then after we've all finished, you're going to have the chance to ask questions and challenge us or reminisce for yourselves. I'm there, by the way, in the middle picture in the Kalahari Desert in 1964. You see the Land Rover. I'm on the right holding a baby baboon, and the man on my right is Richard Lee, who was studying the Bushmen, and the photograph was taken by Irvin de Vore. Right, so I put that there to show that I'm not a complete interloper in these circles, but in fact, of course, I'm a social anthropologist, which in many ways is probably rather different. But just to say how I came into anthropology because of my aunt, who was an anthropologist. And she was a specialist in the study of the Swazi. And when I was 18, she asked me to chauffeur her on a trip into Swaziland, and went along to Swaziland was a dual monarchy. It was a king and a queen mother. And so we went along to the Queen Mother's capital, where my aunt had lived for 2 years doing field work. And I couldn't go in because only women were allowed inside, so I had to go and camp with the regiment that was guarding the palace. And there was a young prince, a young Swazi prince, who took care of me. And he was wearing the whole gear, the toga and the spear and the headband and so on. We sat down in this beehive hut, and some soldiers brought in some beer, and we were drinking beer. And we started talking. He spoke perfect English because he'd been educated at Repton. We spoke about football and this and that. And then he said to me, "Do you believe in witchcraft?" Now I was just 18, and I just stopped believing in all sorts of things. And I said, "No." And he looked at me with sort of pity. And he said, "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy." So I thought, well, if you have an African prince quoting Shakespeare in defense of belief in witchcraft, this could be actually quite an interesting subject. But when I actually went to do field work in the Kalahari, you see over there, I didn't, being an impoverished colonial student, doing a PhD at Cambridge and therefore no money at all, I didn't have any way of getting into the Kalahari. But my aunt told me that there were these two Harvard anthropologists, Irvin de Vore and Richard Lee, and they had a Land Rover, and they would take me into the Kalahari if I met them at the Rhodes Livingston Museum in Lusaka. And they took me in, and they had this baby baboon with them, because driving down through Tanzania, they had found it on the dead body of its mother, still suckling. So the four of us traveled around the Kalahari together. And what they were doing was a very different kind of study to the sort of study that we were being prepared for at Cambridge at the time. Because Devore, of course, had pioneered the field study of the social organization of African primates in Kenya. And this project was to do a comparative study of hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari in order to relate foraging practices, ecological niches, and all this sort of thing to this other kind of primate behavior. I then met a Japanese anthropologist who was also in the Kalahari, Jiro Tanaka, who was doing a similar study. He was from Kyoto, where, of course, the very famous studies of primates had been done, and he had also been sent to the Kalahari to do a comparative study of hunter-gatherers. But he had very strict methodology. He was told that he had to study Kalahari Bushmen in the same way as he had studied primates in Kyoto. So he couldn't speak to anybody, and he shouldn't learn the language. He should just sit under a tree and say, A grooms B, C moves into the bushes, and so on and so on. But he was a very sociable sort of chap, and in no time at all he was speaking the language and friendly with all sorts of people, so his study was ruined. But he learned quite a lot about the Bushmen. So I came away from this with a sort of double feeling that certainly there was a connection between primate studies and the studies, social studies of human beings, but human beings were, in some important ways, still rather different. And I think this really has been, in many ways, one of the main themes of the great advances in the studies of human evolution that have been made in the last generation. Most of the members of the panel started in the field roughly at the same time in the 1960s, and several of them began in Cambridge. And so I'm going to start off by asking Professor Robert Foley, the Professor of Human Evolution at Cambridge, to give us some background of the starting point, the collective institutional starting point from which we all began. Professor Foley.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to say that I'm not here to give a personal history. That's because I'm too young to have one at this stage, as I pointed out to Chris earlier. But no, I want to, from the Leakey Hume Centre, who's partly sponsoring this, to welcome you all. And we're going to hear the personal histories of four very distinguished people working in human evolution. So we have David Pilbeam, who has contributed an enormous amount to understanding the origins of the hominoids and their evolution, the apes to which we belong, and the beginnings of human evolution. And we have Meave Leakey, who, if I could have found 1% of the fossils that she'd found, I would probably be very happy. Contributed to our understandings of the Australopithecines, and then Chris Stringer picking up the end of the story. We all know from his work on the origins of modern humans and one of the founding people of the Out of Africa model, and Leslie Aiello, who many of you know for her work linking the evolution of brains to energy and our understanding of the whole principles lying behind evolution. And they're going to tell the stories of their personal history. And I wonder what I could say as a sort of precedent to that. And there are a couple of things that I thought might be interesting, that really, in the end, any science is a mixture of the contributions of the people and their personal histories, but also with the institutions with which they're associated. And you can't really have one without the other. And I'll just sort of perhaps say, if we look at Cambridge and its contribution, if we'd held this meeting 40 years ago, we would have filled a smallish coffee room, probably with the number of people who might be interested in human evolution. If we tried something on evolution and humans 30 years ago, we'd still have only filled a small coffee room, but we'd probably have had 2 or 3 times that number of people outside the room protesting that we shouldn't be looking at humans from an evolutionary perspective. This was the height of sociobiology and the selfish gene of Richard Dawkins and many of the ideas that we have today. So in that sense, the world of anthropology, the world of the study of human evolution has changed dramatically in those years. And in a way, there are 2 or 3 things that are involved in that development. And Cambridge is interesting in this because it's played a part, but it's only played a peripheral part in many ways. I think it's fair to say Cambridge got off to the best possible start for the study of human evolution because, of course, Charles Darwin was a graduate here. And a theme that was recurrent is, of course, that he did what many people did, which was to leave. And after Darwin, we then have relatively little by way of a Cambridge contribution until we come to Louis Leakey, Meave's father-in-law, who was a student here, read archaeology and anthropology, was a fellow of St. John's, and also began to explore human evolution, began a lot of the work out in Africa, but again left and, of course, made his name as very much an African, a Kenyan, working in Kenya in that way. Philip Tobias, the great figure of South African archaeology, passed through Cambridge as well, and in many ways it's a shame he's not here today because he would have more stories than anybody else about this whole period. And so it goes on, and in fact, David Pilbeam, who will tell us, I hope, a little bit about Cambridge, was here too before going to the States. So we are one of the great exporters of expertise in human evolution. That's not to say human evolution wasn't important in Cambridge during this period, but in a slightly different way, because much of what we do today was built on the foundations of genetics, and R.A. Fisher was a major contributor, and I think I see Anthony up there. Anthony was the last student of Fisher, who also contributed to some of the beginnings of our understanding of humans from genetics across that period, as were people like Cavalli-Sforza. So people have passed through. And one can ask the question, well, why didn't it become established here? And I think there are a number of reasons, which we might hopefully explore a bit this afternoon. But I think the real one is that the real big interest, intellectual interest in human evolution did not or put it the other way around, that when Cambridge was expanding in the 60s and 70s, it did not coincide with a great interest in evolution. In fact, it was probably a very low point for the interest. The great burgeoning of the fossil record in the 70s, the work of Meave and so on, and the 80s, came during a depression. The enormous expansion that there was then in the 80s and 90s with molecular evolution began to pick up more by way of it. So this is as personal as I get. In the late 1990s and in 2000, Marta Mirazanlara and myself proposed to the university that we should do something to perhaps try and make the future of human evolution in Cambridge more stable, and that there should be a centre for human evolutionary studies. I hope you'll all come over and have a drink in the centre that came about as a result of this as it grew up. And our idea then was that we would introduce into Cambridge the study of human evolution and try and make it a core part of the intellectual world here. We have yet to do so, but we're still working on it. But there was an important theme, and I mentioned in the development of the subject, we have fossils, we have genetics. Of course, many of the things we think about with human evolution come from study of primates and animal behavior, and indeed the sub-department of animal behavior here sponsored the work of Jane Goodall in particular, which lay an important part. So what primates can tell us about these things, and the archaeology that people like Paul Mellors in the archaeology department, bringing together archaeology and anthropology. So if you ask, what are the personal histories about. They are about the energy of people to go out and find things, to make discoveries, to do a lot of thinking about them. But in the end, they have to be translated into the institutions which will reproduce. And I think today, seeing so many young people here, this is an element of reproduction, institutional and personal reproduction going on, in a very discreet way, I might say, in passing on that. And for us, certainly in the Centre for Human Evolution here, it's about bringing together all the different ways you can ask questions about human evolution. You can ask questions about human evolution from genetics. You can ask it from psychology. You can ask them from linguistics, from fossils and so on. Every single one of them has something to contribute, and that breaks down the boundaries that lie between the classic disciplines. So for me, the great thrill of seeing so many people here who probably come from an enormous diversity of disciplines and histories is that we're all interested in human evolution. And in the end, it's the people who make it and then manage to transmit it, partly to persuade governments and universities to put their money into it, because without the money, we don't do it, and partly to persuade the universities that these are things that students want to learn about and to pass on. So with nothing else to say, I will just now give you the opportunity to listen to these four distinguished anthropologists and people who've spent their lives mucking about in human evolution. So thank you.
Thank you. When we were trying to work out a batting order, somebody, I think Chris Stringer, suggested that the only logical one was to start with the person who was working on the very earliest links of human evolution. So we're going to start with David Pilbeam, whose work is really concerned with trying to understand the transition from the ape ancestors to the earliest hominids. David is Henry Ford II Professor of Human Evolution at Harvard University, but he began his career as an undergraduate in Arkananth over here.
Thank you. I've got 15 minutes to talk about 47 years, so it's 3 years a minute. And I probably will talk fast, otherwise I'll still be in 1968 by the time my time's up. If any of you are looking for career advice, I'm not the person to listen to. Okay, that's the first point to make. I think of the study of human evolution as a question. Rob's just made this point as well. It's a question, what happened in human evolution and why? And to answer the question, you have to be actually something of a jack of all trades, which suits me perfectly. And I like to tell people, or say to people, that what I've done in my life is far better than having a job. I came up to Cambridge in 1959 actually as a medical student. I read natural sciences for medicine for the first 2 years and decided that I wouldn't be very comfortable as a doctor, and probably vice versa as well. During that 2-year period, I met the late, great Glyn Isaac, one of the great Paleolithic archaeologists. It's often joked to his wife, Barbara, that I saw Glyn in the flesh long before she did, because we were both on the Peterhouse cross-country team. I switched in 1961 into physical anthropology and came under the influence, even spell, of a great eclectic, polymathic eccentric named Jack Trevor. And there are many, many wonderful stories I could tell, but I won't. We had a series of visitors who would come up to Cambridge to give lectures, and John Napier came up and gave the human evolution lectures. He was a main exponent early on in this country of functional anatomy, how you can look at the anatomy of bones and say something about the way they function, and then through that how you might infer behavior of a past species. And on one occasion, he was lecturing on hominid origins. I'm old-fashioned, where you're supposed to call them hominins now, but I can't pick up the habit. Hominid is anything that goes back to the last common ancestor of humans and something else. He was lecturing, and he mentioned that there was this young man at Yale named Elwyn Simons who had worked on an obscure fossil found in 1932 in India, found by a young American geology graduate student. The fossil name was Ramapithecus, and Elwyn was about to publish a paper showing that Ramapithecus was indeed the oldest hominid. Ramapithecus was then datable to be between 10 and 15 million years. I discovered the nicest, quietest place in Cambridge to work. And that's the library of the Cambridge Philosophical Society, because every time I don't recall ever seeing anybody else there when I was there. And I was able to track down a journal, Postilla, which is produced by the Yale Peabody Museum in 1961. It had Elwyn's description or redescription of Ramapithecus, in which he argued that it was a hominid. And I became hooked. Now, it's worth remembering that at this time, the great apes, chimps, gorillas, orangutans, were seen as being monophyletic. That's to say, they shared a common ancestry different from that of humans. And because humans and apes were so different from each other, it was assumed that they must be anciently derived. Turns out to be wrong, but that's okay. So that's the kind of mental mindset in which I grew up. And I just... the Duckworth Laboratory won't mean much to many of you, but it was the name of the place where we all worked in those times. And W.L.H. Duckworth wrote a book in 1904 called Morphology and Anthropology. I just happened to look through it before I took the plane out last week. And great apes were monophyletic and humans were very anciently derived. April 1962, Jack took me to the zoo, to a symposium sponsored by the Zoological Society of London, which brought together morphologists, anatomists, geneticists, behaviorists, and fossil people. And I had the great pleasure of listening to a young woman primatologist describe tool making in chimps, and that was Jane Goodall. And I'm not sure if that was the very first public presentation, but it was a very early one. I graduated in 1963, and I went to Yale for a year, largely because Jack had spent a year in the States before the war, and he thought that it would be good for me, so off I went, and I ended up at Yale working with Aiello Simons. I had absolutely no intention of doing a PhD, had no intention of being an academic. I, in fact, at that time still didn't have a clue what I was going to do, but I became hooked, yet again, thoroughly hooked, on studying the early, what we then thought was the early hominid fossil record and the record of contemporary and earlier apes. And I ended up doing a PhD with fossil material that Elwyn kindly passed on to me. He'd been given the opportunity to work on a set of ape fossils from Uganda, and again another great late colleague, Bill Bishop. But they came to me, and in 1965, after just 2 years at Yale, I came back here. I'm going to take a chance and tell the story of how I was hired, because it's very, very different from how you're hired today. So I've been in Yale for 2 years. I had a fellowship for my third year when I was going to write up my thesis, and it was in the summer, and I don't know how I was tracked down, but the phone rang in the flat I was renting. It was Jack. And he said, David, my boy, there's a position opening up here. Would you be interested? I said, well, yes, it's terrific, because I've only got another year to go and I'll be finished. I can come back. And he said, no, you don't understand. Just come out of a search committee meeting. Do you want the job? Yes. So that's how I got the job. And as I say, they don't do it that way. Or if they still do it that way, they should be ashamed of themselves. So I came back to Cambridge and spent 3 years in the Duckworth. And at about the time I came back, the genetic revolution was having a major impact within paleoanthropology and primatology. In fact, Maurice Goodman had begun writing in the late 50s, showing that great apes were not monophyletic, that humans were actually genetically African apes. And more or less at the same time, Vince Sarich and Alan Wilson at Berkeley had figured out how you could show that there was a reasonably plausible one-to-one relationship between the degree of genetic difference between any pair of species and how and how long it was since they were separated. So they had, in a sense, they didn't invent the molecular clock, that's Emil Zuckerkandl, but they had elaborated it and demonstrated how you could figure this out without recourse to any fossils. Now, of course, I, like any sensible, rational, smart paleontologist, said this is complete garbage. Everybody knows that evolution doesn't plough ahead, ticking away constantly. It stops and it starts, it stops and it starts. Of course, it turned out we were wrong, they were right, but that took a little bit of time to work itself out. I continued field work while I was here. I worked in Uganda. I supervised many people, many distinguished people. Tim Clutton-Brock, who I think is probably here, now professor. Here, the Prince of Wales. Alison Richard, whose name might be familiar to some of you. And then I became very good friends with a number of people who... Paul Mellers, very distinguished archaeologist here, and two people who are sadly also dead, David Clark and the aforementioned Bill Bishop. I went back to Yale in 1968, as it turned out, for 13 years, and I worked with Elwyn. Again, great enjoyment. Alison Richard joined us in 1972 as an assistant professor, a junior colleague, and she eventually rocketed through the ranks and became provost and then was recruited back here. And I just learned she's in her last year, so I think the current president of Yale is going to do another year, so just watch out. You heard it here. You heard it here first. And I continued field projects and particularly developed a very long-term field project in Pakistan, looking for Ramapithecus. Started in 1973, and in a sense it's still continuing. We can't go there, it's physically too dangerous, but we have Pakistanis who are the intellectual descendants of people who began their work as young graduate students in the early 70s. I went there because I was looking for good evidence of Ramapithecus to prove, damn it, that it really was a hominid. We've ended up with an extraordinary collection of fossils. The sequence runs from 18 million to 5 million, more or less continuously. It's very, very fossiliferous. And we're able to figure out, we understand something about habitat and climate change through time, so we can look at the patterning of faunal change versus environmental change, which has been probably the most enjoyable, intellectually most enjoyable part of my work. While I was at Yale, I had a number of very interesting interactions that were quite formative. I realized this both at the time and then also looking back. J.T. Robinson is a name that may not be familiar to all of you. He was a student of Robert Broom, and he worked in the 1940s through the 1970s on Australopithecines in South Africa, and he knew his Australopithecines, he knew his hominids. He came to Yale in 1970 to look at Ramapithecus. After he looked and looked and looked, I walked over to my office with him and I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Well, it's certainly not a hominid. It doesn't look anything like one." And I thought, yes, it is. But, oh dear, so tick, tick, tick. I also got to know what would we call him, a molecular systematist, someone who used genetics to look at the relationships of animals, in this case birds, named Charles Sibley, who was working on a technique called DNA hybridization, which is actually a very nifty way of looking at degree of genetic difference between species. It's gone out of fashion because it's not high-tech enough, but it actually works really quite well. And I persuaded Charles to give up birds and look at the relationship between humans and apes. And it was Charles who first figured out that humans and chimps are closest relatives, then gorillas, then orangutans. And Charles got into a lot of trouble because several people said he'd cooked his data. Well, it turns out that if he did cook his data, he did so in a brilliant way because his results exactly match what you get when you do whole genome sequencing. We found quite a lot of primate fossils, Ramapithecus, and a larger fella called Shivapithecus. And it became clear to me, finally, I was not the first to figure this out, nor was I the last, that I had been wrong, that Ramapithecus was not a hominid. It's probably the lady Shivapithecus. Shivapithecus is the guy Shivapithecus. And I think I'm almost alone in not believing that Shivapithecus is an ancestor of the orangutan, but that's another matter. I moved to Harvard in 1981 and in 1982, began planning a project in West Africa. I had thought, well, look, we have a growing appreciation of what's going on in Asia, but the fossil record in Africa of these early things was deficient in certain time periods, and it was certainly deficient in those parts of Africa where you might have expected to find the common ancestor of chimps and humans, which almost certainly was going to be pretty chimp-like. And I had become good pals with a man named Michel Brunet, who's a French paleontologist, then at the University of Poitiers, now a professor at the Collège de France. And we cooked up a project in Cameroon. And we went to Cameroon in the early 80s and worked there for a while and found some interesting stuff, but nothing of the right age. And then one day, Michel said, look, I'm going to go north, I'm going to go to Chad, let's go. And I said, no, I don't want to do that, I've just become a father. And he went to Chad and he found some fantastic material. And I'll tell you the definition of honor. Brunet has put my name on every paper, on every hominid he's found in Chad, even though I haven't been there. And I said to him, I can't imagine why you would do this, and I don't know anybody else who would do this. And he said, David, we began this West Side story together, and we're going to finish it together. So that's honor. I overlapped, again, very briefly with the great Glyn Isaac at Harvard. He died tragically young. His successor, Ofer Bar Yosef, wonderful Israeli, both splendid Paleolithic archaeologists, and I've enjoyed hanging out with Richard Wrangham, and a great behavioral ecologist. I'm also fortunate to be married to Mary Ellen Ruvelo, who's a molecular geneticist, and so it's not only through her. I was interested in this stuff before I became interested in her, but I've certainly maintained a very strong interest in what is now clearly the enormously important role that molecular genetics plays in understanding anything about evolution. I'm going to stop now, but I'll just give you a quick list of the things I'm currently interested in, if they pique anybody's interest. We can talk about them later. I'm monographing the Pakistan material. I'm working with Michel on a Chad monograph. I'm working on a project looking closely at the mammalian fossil record to find cases where you can plausibly use the fossil record to calibrate the proportional tree that you can get from studying genetics. And it turns out to be a lot harder than one might think. I've become interested, again, with some genetics colleagues in using the enormously abundant genomic record. You can compare the genomes of two species, for example, humans and chimps, and you can make some interesting inferences about how they split apart. So you can look at patterns of speciation. And finally, I've become very interested in what's called EVO-DEVO, evolutionary developmental biology, which is really the application of molecular genetics to embryology, and is a study of how you can change developmental patterns through, first of all, basically understanding them at the genetic level, but also imagining how selection can act on these programs, so that you could imagine how you could turn a rather chimp-like organism developmentally into ultimately us. So that's it.
Thank you. Moving on an evolutionary stage, Meave Leakey, who works particularly on very, very early hominids in East Africa, her career actually has in a way recapitulated the story of evolution, because she began as a specialist in fish. She then moved on to animals, later specialized in primates, and finally, most recently, has become very interested in very early human beings. Dr. Leakey, of course, married into the royal family of African human evolutionary research. And she is herself now a very well-known star member of that very important team.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honour to be here because the Leakeys have had an association with Cambridge, and largely through Lewis, who was here for a long time. Richard always wanted to come here but was rejected. Simply because he hadn't got A-levels, I think. But was finally given an honorary degree, so he's now okay. I never made it at all, but I never actually applied. I'm a bit of an imposter, as you heard just now. I never ever intended to do paleoanthropology or look for fossils or anything like that. I was always dead set on doing marine zoology or oceanography. I had the, well, it wasn't really misfortune, but at any rate, when I grew up, I was at a girls' school, and girls in those days weren't considered to learn science. And so I went through school, and my parents didn't realize what was happening, but we had what was called general science, where you learnt everything there was to know about science in one subject. And then you took an O-level exam at the end of it, and you were supposed to be an expert in science. Well, you know, if you try and apply for any job in science after that sort of education, you can forget it. So my parents were really horrified, but it was one of those things that they hadn't really appreciated because women weren't, you know, it just one of those things. That's how it was in those days. So I went to a technical college and learnt all the necessary things to get into university, and then chose the University of North Wales at Bangor to do my first degree, simply because it had the most fantastic marine station. And everyone said, well, don't do that because you'll have to do a joint honours degree with marine zoology and zoology, and it'll be much too hard work. Just don't bother. You won't get a good degree. But, you know, I thought, well, you know, that's what I want to do. That's why I'm here. So, of course, I wasn't going to give up that easily. And so when I finally got my degree, and I did get an upper second, actually, in spite of the predictions, and then I started happily applying for jobs. But, here we get the gender problem again. And at that time, there were no facilities on boats for women. I mean, a few did make it, but I wasn't one of them. And I got a bit discouraged, and I guess discouraged a bit too fast, I suppose. And so I started looking for other jobs, and I found on the back of the Times newspaper, which in those days had these amazing adverts on the back cover for all sorts of things, some of them more better than others, but among them was this tiny little advert saying there was a position in Kenya available at a monkey research station, primate research station. And anyone interested should phone this number. And that was all. So I thought, well, you know, to hell with it, why not? I'd love to go to Kenya, I'd love to go to Africa. Let's ring. And so I went into this telephone booth, and I was a bit excited, so I hadn't really thought about how much money I had or what I had in my pockets. And I had all these tiny little coins, and so I was feeding this machine as fast as I could because Lewis Leakey was on the other end of the phone. And I thought, oh my goodness. So anyway, fortunately my money just lasted long enough for him to tell me to come and have an interview in London, which I did. And at the interview, Jane Goodall's mother was really the person interviewing me, and Lewis was, you know, just sort of looking on. And Jane Goodall's mother was very good at seeing what sort of people she was talking to, and her interest was really whether I would be able to go to Africa and manage in a situation where it wasn't particularly comfortable and it was going to be difficult and hard work and everything. So anyway, she decided I'd fit the bill. And so a month later or something like that, I was on the aeroplane off to Kenya. I arrived in Kenya, and Lewis met me at the airport, gave me a fantastic weekend. He took me down to Olduvai, he took me around the Nairobi Game Park, and all along the way there were various, what he called VIPs. And VIPs were people who potentially could give him money for his projects. And he used to give his VIPs a really good taste of anything he was doing or whatever. So we went to Olduvai. I saw Olduvai, and I thought, wow, this is really something. It was absolutely fantastic. It was the most amazing weekend. You know, coming from North Wales and not really thinking about paleoanthropology and suddenly being at Olduvai Gorge. So anyway, he then said to me, well, now, at the end, on Sunday evening, it's time we went to Tigoni, and I'm going to leave you at this primate research centre, and I haven't told them you're coming. Because they wanted somebody to help, but they didn't want a young student who didn't know anything about primates or anything else. Anyway, so he drops me up there and says, okay, bye-bye. So the lady who ran that centre was actually an extremely difficult woman. She really didn't want me there. So that evening, as I went to bed, and I'll never forget this, she presented me with a glass of water, that perhaps I would like this for the night. And at the bottom of this glass of water was the biggest flatworm you ever saw. And I'm quite sure she must have been nurturing this thing for ages. Because I've never seen anything like it since. Anyway, so to cut a long story short, because I got a high enough degree at Bangor, they gave me a research grant, so I could do some research for my PhD while I was at the monkey station. And Lewis, at the time, had this theory that you could identify animals from the difference in the morphology of their skeletons. And most people had always looked at skulls, and nobody had really looked at skeletons. And he said, I can tell you what bone this is by putting it in my mouth, so of course it's, there's something to look at. But Lewis always had these funny stories. I never actually tested it, whether he could put a bone in his mouth and tell you which monkey it came from. But anyway, so he said he would like me to look at, they had a good collection of monkey skeletons up there, and he would like me to look at these skeletons and see if I could see patterns through the skeletons that would associate them with particular taxa. And at that time I met this problem of function and phylogeny. How much is due to function, how much is due to phylogeny, and it's still something that bugs me today with the fossils. Anyway, during that time, I collected enough data, went back to Bangor, wrote up my dissertation, and it was a time when computers were just coming in. And we had this enormous computer with ticker tape that went for miles and these big wheels that went around. But it did enable me to do a multivariate analysis. And today, which was really fun, just now at tea, the man who examined my PhD, called Professor Anthony Edwards, came up to me and said, how do you do? I haven't seen you for a long time. And I thought, wow. Because I hadn't heard, I hadn't seen him or known what's happened to him ever since, and he's here too. So anyway, so having got my PhD, I went back to the Primate Centre because Cynthia Booth, the lady who was running it, was leaving, and because she was so difficult, Lewis said, please come and just be here while she leaves, keep things running, and then you can go and do whatever you want to do. So I said, okay, but only 6 months, I don't want any more than that. And during that time, I met Richard Leakey, and he was, at that time, just starting work at Turkana. And he was looking for a team of people in different disciplines who could study all the fossils and study the geology and the isotopes and everything else. And so he said, come up and study the monkeys, since this is what your speciality is now. So that is how I got into paleoanthropology, because immediately I got up there, I just fell in love with everything, including Richard. And so and one of the first things we did was to go off on a camel trip, where on that very first trip we found a skull actually it was of an Australopithecus boisei, sitting in a stream bed, and we were just walking down a stream bed, and there's this thing looking at us. In fact, I think it's the one in that picture there. And I thought, wow, if this is how you find fossil hominids, this is for me. But since then, I've discovered it just isn't like that. So anyway, so I've been working at Turkana ever since. That was in '69, and I'm 2 years behind David, I think, in terms of when I got my degree and everything else. And we've gone along very different courses, of course. But the system, the way we've gone through the evolution of paleoanthropology is the same. So those are the early years. And in the 60s and 70s, as David mentioned, a lot was going on at that time. And the 60s, there were a lot of things being found at Olduvai. In the 70s, there were lots of things being found in a number of places, including Turkana, Olduvai as well. In Ethiopia, that was the years that Lucy was found, when Mary found her footprints. And so suddenly, from not having any evidence at all, when we started in 68, there were just four specimens that could be called hominins from Kenya. And now, of course, there's masses from Kenya, masses from Tanzania, Ethiopia, and we have a good picture from the fossils of how our ancestors developed and evolved. And the fossils are really the primary data on which all this story is based, and so they are really the most important things. They're also the most difficult things to find. You cannot speed up this field work. It takes ever. It takes ages and ages. And the way we find fossils is simply to walk along the surface, look at our feet, grub around in the dust and the dirt, and then if you're lucky, you find something. If you're not, you don't. And in spite of all the developments of technology over time, which are really impressive, nothing has changed in the way that we find our fossils, that we excavate our fossils, and the way that we wrap them up in plaster of Paris in order to transport them. That is all the same. The way we record them, document them with digital cameras, with GPS units, the way we analyze with GIS, CT scanners, and all these things, that's completely changed. And to show you exactly how that is, when Lewis published Australopithecus boisei, his Synjanthropus, in 1959, if you look at that paper, it's 2 pages with a little photograph, no references, no detailed description, and he sent it off to Nature, and the only reason it took more than 3 weeks to be published was because there was a postal strike here in Britain. So today, last year, when we published the paper on Homo erectus and Homo habilis, I mean, it took for ages to get the comparative data, because you have to go all over the world, because Homo erectus is known from so many places and there's so many specimens. Homo habilis, there's a number of specimens from various places. And our database is enormous. And so you have to compile all that data. And Nature only allows you a certain number of words, but they insist that you actually publish all the evidence. And so you have your little Nature paper, which is a whole lot more detailed than Lewis's was, and massive references, and then you have 15 pages or more of supplementary data. So the way now to get things published is really different. And I think for a long time, paleoanthropology wasn't considered to be really a rigorous science. It was just, a few people who went off to scrub in the dirt and found a few things, and that was it. But now, I think it's really come of age and matured, and I think this science now is, nobody would say it wasn't a science, and nobody would say it was a sort of amateur's pastime. I think my time is up. I've got lots more to say, but I'm not allowed to, so maybe later. But just to end like David did and say what my current interests are, we're working at Turkana in the time interval between 2 million years, or just over 2 million years, and 1.5 million years, which is the time when there was the Homo radiation. So you had Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, Homo erectus, living alongside Australopithecus boisei. So you had at least 4 species of human ancestors living together. But the radiation of the hominids is almost as enigmatic as it was in the 70s when we started finding these things, and Lewis and Mary found them at Olduvai, and we were finding them at Turkana. And nobody could really figure out what Homo habilis was, and nobody could really figure out what this specimen that you see me holding there, which has got named along the way by a Russian scientist, Homo rudolfensis, whether that's actually Homo habilis or not. And still these arguments go on, and whether Homo habilis evolved into Homo erectus or whether it didn't. And there are a lot of different opinions about this. And so we're working in that area trying to find more evidence. And what we really need is a skeleton, because we only have a skeleton of Homo erectus. We don't have a skeleton of Homo habilis. And I have a sneaky suspicion, though I have no data or evidence for it, that when we find Homo habilis, it's not going to look like Homo erectus' skeleton. It's going to be very different. And that could even be the reason why Homo habilis died out and Homo erectus didn't. And Homo erectus did not give rise to Homo habilis did not give rise to Homo erectus, as far as I'm concerned. But if you want these questions, you can answer them later, because I have to stop now. So thank you very much.
I thought Meave was going to tell the story of Louis Leakey coming out to Cambridge, and in those days, as an undergraduate, you had to offer a modern language. And he said his modern language was Kikuyu. And there was nothing in the regulations against it, but they couldn't find an examiner. So they wrote to the School of Oriental and African Studies and said, well, they couldn't provide an examiner, but fortunately, the leading expert was in the country at the moment, and his name was Louis Leakey. we're now going to move yet further along the evolutionary bush. And Professor Leslie Aiello, who is the current director of the Wenner-Gren Foundation of Anthropological Research, will talking. She was Professor of Biological Anthropology at University College London, and she's probably known to many of you as the author of the famous Introduction to Human Evolutionary Anatomy. Leslie.
Okay, well, and thinking about this and thinking about my own life in the field, I realized how much of my own career was based on chance, on people dying, and also on decisions I really didn't think about too much at that time. Now, my story starts in 1963, and I was an undergraduate student at UCLA in Los Angeles, and I was trying to put together enough credits so I could graduate a little rapidly. And my major at that point was zoology. And I discovered that I could get 8 credits, 2 course credits, for going on an archaeological field trip during the summer. So I decided to do this. And I was excited, enamored, it was great fun. But what I did when I came back to the university, I consciously sat down and thought that I was a woman. I wasn't going to have to support myself. It didn't matter what my career was. And I could indulge myself in my undergraduate career. Little did I know 40 years later I'd be sitting here. Now, UCLA at that time was very heady. We had the Lewis and Sally Binford were there. It was a very exciting place to be. But I made my way sort of normally through the undergraduate program, right into the graduate program. My master's degree was in Upper Paleolithic archaeology. And I had some very exciting field seasons in the Dordogne. And I was just, the Dordogne, of course, the painted caves, it's very seductive. But I found that at that point, Upper Paleolithic archaeology, even though Lewis and Sally Binford were running through the site and Francois Borde was there, de Soigneau Borde and all, I had the very strong impression that if I didn't do straight description and serration of tools, that I wasn't going to get anywhere. And I was getting more and more interested in how you can interpret material to reconstruct with these fossils how they lived, what they look like, and all of this type of thing. Now, in my own career, you have to remember that this was the late 1960s in California. And we were all a little bit alternative. And at that point, when I got my master's, I decided there were other things to do in the world. But it's very difficult to actually support yourself while you're doing it. And so I started teaching part-time, in junior colleges and state colleges. And the first time I more or less had an advantage because of the death of someone was in a California state college, a four-year college. I only had a master's degree at this time. And there was a position caused by a death, and they said, would you like to come as a full-time lecturer? And I sort of looked at them and said, well, why, of course. Now, I spent 2 years there, and during that time, my own personal life fell apart a bit. My husband told me I was redundant to requirements. I also met a woman named Gail Kennedy, who had done her PhD in London with Michael Day. And at that point, London was the place to come if you were interested in the interpretive aspects of human evolution. It was a lot of the Louis Leakey's material from Olduvai, and then again with the Kobe-Fora material. There was a very strong connection with the London anatomists. Now, this woman, Gail Kennedy, had just returned, was teaching at this little provincial college that I happened to end up with. She looked at me and she said, Leslie, she said, you need a break. Why don't you go to London? And just before this, I'd restarted my PhD at UCLA, and Bernard Campbell was there. And he's sitting right in front of me in the audience here. He was my first PhD supervisor. But fortuitously, again, after that year, he left. And I was left at UCLA with no PhD supervisor, no reason to stay in California because of my personal situation. And here was this wonderful opportunity. So I came to the UK. At that time, it was very different. Michael Day at St. Thomas's Hospital said, don't worry about fees. Just do your PhD, we'll take care of, all of the costs for you. And I only found this Thomas's, at least at that time, maybe it still is, was one of the wealthiest medical schools in the country. So here they were funding this overseas student. But there was absolutely no training or support. And Michael Day just said, well, go do your thesis. Now, I have to admit that year was one of the most miserable years in my life. But it wasn't because I met Chris that year and Peter Andrews and all of the rest of us that were interested in human evolution. But one of the big turning points in my life was, again, a death. And this was Nigel Barnicott, who was the first professor of biological anthropology at UCL. And at that point, Barnicott couldn't stand the professor of social anthropology, and that was M.G. Smith. And they used to take their fights directly to the provost. And when Barnicott died unexpectedly, the provost was going to close biological anthropology at UCL because he felt it was just too much of a problem. And I was hired in to fill the teaching for 12 months. And that was all I wanted, because I just wanted to finish my research and go back to California. Now, that was now about 35 years ago. And, I woke up, 30 years later and sort of forgot to go home. But in that time period, it was actually an extremely heady period. We had some very good people in London. There were Chris and Peter Andrews at the museum. Bernard Wood was at the Middlesex Hospital. John Napier was still there. It was a very stimulating time period to be working. Along the line of things happening fortuitously, it took me, because I still didn't have my PhD, and I sort of, the PhD was the hobby. It took me at that point 6 years to do it. And by the time I finished my PhD in the early 80s, I decided, well, if I was really interested in research, I had to start doing something. And one of the seminal publications in my career was the Stern and Sussman description of Australopithecus afarensis, or of Lucy, because I didn't understand a word of it. They took no prisoners in terms of the anatomical analysis. And I was, trying to teach all these students human evolution and interpret, what they were trying to say about the Lucy skeleton. And that was the inception of the anatomy book, because I thought if I don't understand what they're talking about and what the significance is, my students didn't understand it, there were probably a lot of people out there. And I remember sitting down one weekend and saying, okay, I'm going to bite the bullet. I'm going to send in a book manuscript, or a book proposal. So it took me about 4 or 5 hours, and I was typed away, what I was going to do in this wonderful book. Put it in the post box. 24 hours later, Academic Press rang. And my response was, my God, the Postal Service is good. And they were apparently it just fell in exactly what they wanted to do. Sign the contract. And then I thought, my God, what have I done? They actually had sent this out for review. And my own PhD supervisor told them I wasn't capable of doing it. Now, this is a good point for any of your students here. Don't believe what people say. If you think you have a good idea, go after it. But I began to have serious second thoughts about it, and went down the hallway to where Christopher Dean was at UCL and said, do you want to do from the neck up? I'll do from the neck down in the anatomy book. And Chris and I had a wonderful 4 years. We never fought over it. We met for breakfast almost every morning, and guess what I found and all. But part of this also was during this time we were writing it. I was invited to come to Yale for a year, and that was an extremely exciting experience. Not only the colleagues there, but also having a library of 9 million volumes. Now, again, along the line of things being extremely fortuitous, another person who was at UCL was Bob Martin. And at that point, Bob, together with David and all, started with the Encyclopedia of Human Evolution. And in fact, Sally Bunny, who's sitting here in the audience, was also extremely involved with that. Well, Bob came down the hall and said, Leslie said, do you want to do a section on energy and evolution? I can't find anyone else to do it. And I said, well, okay, it might be fun. And I did 1,000 words or however long it was on the energetic aspects of evolution. That was what started the brains and guts idea. And, this was totally foreign to my own interest in the postcranial skeleton and comparative anatomy. And so I sat there and, did some reading. And I discovered that there was this one problem of where that energy that drives this big brain comes from. Nobody had an answer to it. But it was just something that I've always considered a hobby. And, it's sort of one step from real life for me. But I think I've been invited to talk more on brains and guts, and then extending to cognitive evolution, language evolution. And it just shot me off on a whole separate direction. Now, while this was all happening, and you have to realize that, the past is really, a different time period, a different country. Things were very different at that point. As we were trying to build the department in London, one of the huge issues was finding funding for graduate students. And as I sort of went up through the ranks and where it became more and more my responsibility, I really decided that I had to try to do something to see if we could generate more funds. And my solution was becoming involved in the graduate school in London, because the graduate school at UCL, it was a new thing at that point, and it gave out grants. And I thought that if I had a position, I ended up being head of the graduate school, but I might be able to, one, raise money, two, funnel money into human evolution. And also, the department in London was the worst accommodated department out of 72 departments at the university. And I was very proud, as Rob and Marta were building the Leverhulme Center here. I had a little alternative thing going in London, and we ended up with the new building there also. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that this was another chance thing that happened in my life. Because at one point, my husband came home and said he was going to take early retirement. And I thought, what are we going to do with this? And just about the same time, I saw the advertisement for the Wenner-Gren Foundation. And it almost looked like it was written for me. They wanted an academic with some administrative experience who was interested in grant giving and all. And it again was one of those things I didn't think about too much. I thought I'd been on Gower Street for 30 years. It was time for a new adventure. And right now I'm in the wonderful position of my only role in life is to give away money. I don't have to fundraise. The endowment came from $2 million of vacuum cleaner stock in 1941. It's never been added to. And it's a very nice position to see the field continue to grow and develop, and also to be able to nudge it in one way or another. At the same time, I'm still have a involvement with the field, and don't think that I've left that second part of my career in my life. So, yeah, thank you very much.
I hope you don't take away from this the idea that all jobs come by chance. It's all just a matter of luck. I just about overlapped with Leslie at University College London in the early 70s, and she spoke about this extremely difficult man who was the professor of social anthropology. The most, without exception, the most difficult academic I had to deal with in my entire life. And so by the accident of his being there, I decided to leave. So I moved elsewhere. Now, finally, we're now making our way to early modern humans. And who better to talk about his experience, personally, his career in investigating early modern humans, than Chris Stringer, who, of course, is one of the founding figures in the advocacy of the Out of Africa School of Thought. He's worked in the Natural History Museum in London since 1973 and is one of the very, very distinguished figures in the field. He's working more recently on ancient human occupation in Britain and published a very, very successful book on that 2 years ago.
Modern technology. Yes, I've just got to find this. Yes, so I've done a PowerPoint presentation very boringly, sorry about that, to try and structure my memories a bit. But yes, I was born in East Ham, so out of East Ham, there I am, my junior school. And one of my first memories is going to the Natural History Museum. It must have been about 1954. My parents took me there, and the Piltdown Man display case was there with a big sign saying, subject to reconsideration, because of new evidence. So it must have been about 1954. And I was very interested in fossils and human evolution. I did a project in junior school about the Neanderthals, and sadly that's all lost now. I wish I still had some of that material. But I do remember reading, must have been when it first came out from the library, I got out Bill Howe's book, Mankind in the Making, which was very interesting. And so I was reading a lot of material, and here's, again, rather dark, but here's something I haven't got much left, but this was a drawing I did when I was 12 of human evolution, and as David's explained, here is proconsul giving rise to the chimpanzees. So here's that early divergence of apes from humans, and then I've got some rather strange progression of skulls going through Java man and Steinheim man to modern humans, and the Neanderthals seem to be coming off separately. So that was something. And my parents and foster parents did think I was a very strange child, drawing skulls all the time. But at that time, I didn't imagine I could actually do this academically, because East Ham was a rather sheltered environment in terms of careers at that time. And the careers advice was very much, do things like medicine. And so I was on track to go to medical school, and I really didn't know you could do a subject called anthropology at university. It was that bad. I really didn't know it existed as an academic subject. And Leslie's talked about chance events, and certainly there were some in my life too, because one of my colleagues went to University College for a physics interview in the sixth form and came back with a prospectus. And he gave it to me to look at, and it was alphabetic, and it opened on A for anthropology. And I said, this is fantastic. This is really what I want to do, archaeology and human evolution. So I withdrew, much to my parents' horror and the teachers' horror, I withdrew my place at medical school and managed to get an interview for UCL to do anthropology. So that's where I went in 1966. And when I sort of, the end of the 1960s, ideas of human evolution there were many different theories about how humans had evolved. So there was the pre-sapiens model, people like Boole and Valois. So on this model, most of the fossils that existed actually were all on side branches of human evolution. They weren't our ancestors. Somewhere in the distant past, and from very obscure fragmentary remains, there was a separate line leading to modern humans, and all these other things were side branches that were going to die out. So this was the pre-sapiens model. Then there was the pre-Neanderthal model of people like Sergi and Clark Howell and Breitinger, the idea that the Neanderthals did play a sort of role in human evolution, but it was the early forms of Neanderthals, the less specialised forms, that were our ancestors, and then they'd gone off in their own direction in Europe to the late Neanderthals, who were a separate branch and died out. But modern humans might have evolved maybe in the Middle East from less specialised Neanderthals. And then really just coming up in the 1960s were the views of Loring Brace, very strongly put that actually it was like a sort of ladder of progress, a unilinear scheme of evolution, that humans, basically all the fossils fitted on a progression leading to modern humans. And Brace was very keen on them all being sort of forms of Neanderthals, so he had a sort of Neanderthaloid stage. And this was also linked with the single species hypothesis. Brace believed that the human evolutionary niche was so all-inclusive that you could only ever have one human species at a time. There was no room for separate branches in human evolution. And there was also the multi-regional model, not in the recent guises, but the version that Franz Weidenreich had proposed, that basically modern humans evolved globally from ancestral forms in each part of the world, but with gene flow between these regions, ending up with the modern humans of today. And also there was a model associated with Joe Viner and Bernard Campbell, the spectrum hypothesis, which was also a fairly new idea at this time, which combined elements of these different theories. So these were the sort of main views that were around. And I was lucky enough, as I finished my degree, 1969 was a very bad year for getting grants, and I didn't. I managed to get a job for 9 months, again, by pure luck. Don Brothwell at the Natural History Museum, that's Don, managed to fix me up with a temporary job at the Natural History Museum for 9 months while I looked around for a PhD grant. So that's Don, and yes, there I am. And luckily my flares are invisible in the darkness down here, my flare trousers. But it was a great place to be for someone who'd just come out of undergraduate life at UCL. Kenneth Oakley was by then really rather frail. This was actually his retirement party. We're saying goodbye to Kenneth. He was in very bad health, but mentally still very, very bright, and he just knew so many people. It was just great to sit down and listen to him talk, because he knew Louis Leakey and Francois Bourd and von Königswald and all of these people. So it was just great to listen to Kenneth talk. And people, colleagues like Rosemary Powers and Ty Mollison, and for them, perhaps these were only rather small things they were doing for me, but they became extremely important, because Rosemary taught me how to measure skulls, which was going to be very useful for my PhD work, and Ty gave me a proof copy of the catalogue of fossil hominids, which she and Kenneth Oakley and Bernard Campbell were preparing at that time. And that got published in 1971, but here I was in 69 with proof copies of this. And this was so important to help me plan my PhD trip. So all of these people contributed at that time in important ways. And in terms of the intellectual content of my PhD, well, there were people who were very influential. And Loring Brace, again, and this is a picture of Loring recently, but in the 60s, he was sort of enfant terrible. He was the guy who really challenged all of the conventional wisdom. He picked fights with almost anyone on human evolution, and very strongly promoting the idea that, the Neanderthals are our ancestors. They're in the right place and the right time. We don't have to look anywhere else for ancestors. So Loring's views were important. Bill Howells, he had been measuring crania in the Natural History Museum collections, and so copies of his studies, some of them unpublished, were around, and Don Brothwell drew them to my attention, and Bill Howells was emphasising the importance of measurements and of the newly emerging multivariate studies, using multivariate analysis to combine measurements of skulls to get overall pictures of how similar and different they were. And I haven't got a picture of Michael Day, unfortunately, but Michael had the Homo kibish fossils, which had been found by Richard Leakey in 1967 in Ethiopia. And Michael was studying them in the late 60s, and he let me look at them and discuss them with Michael. And Michael was one of the people trying to get me funding for a PhD, which would have included more work on these. And Don Brothwell just was healthily sceptical of received wisdom, and as Leslie said, not to take everyone's word for it, actually, to really think for yourself. And I think Don was really a very good influence. And he helped me formulate my PhD proposal, which I couldn't get funded. But luckily, when I was about to go off to Teachers Training College, about 2 months before I was going to go to Teacher Training College, someone in Bristol phoned up from the Department of Anatomy and said, "We've got a spare Medical Research Council grant here for someone working on evolutionary anatomy. Do you know anyone, Don?" And well, Don did know somebody. And so I got an interview and then went to Bristol to do my PhD. And, well, you're familiar with this picture now. So I began my PhD in 1970 in Bristol, and the first year was spent using that catalogue of fossil hominids data, which Ty had kindly given me, to plan a trip in my Morris 1000, driving around Europe for 4 months. I did about 5,000 miles. And it was a great adventure. It really was. I got robbed a few times, and I got arrested once, and I nearly didn't get let into Czechoslovakia, which of course was then really strongly communist, and it was the third anniversary of the revolution, or the fourth anniversary, and third anniversary of the Prague Spring and the invasion by the Soviets. So they took one look at me with my long hair, and they decided I was an undesirable, until one of the border guards said, but he looks a bit like Che Guevara, and Che was a communist, so maybe he's all right. So they let me in. So again, it was just so... anyway, so there I am, and yes, and measuring these fossils all over Europe. So I came back from that trip with a lot of data, and by 1973 I was finishing my PhD, and again chance intervened. A job came up at the Natural History Museum, and Don invited me to interview for it, and I got that job. So just when I was finishing my PhD, I managed to get back to the Natural History Museum, and in 1974 I published my first results and finished my thesis, and these were some of these generalised distance measures of different skulls. The smaller the number, the more similar they are to each other in shape. So this was supposedly a very objective way of getting around these problems of people pointing at skulls and saying, well, it looks like a Neanderthal, looks like a modern human. The idea was that the measurements would help determine the relationships of these different fossils from each other. And sorry about this one, but this is a network of where I attempted to summarise some of my PhD results. Don't worry about all the labelling, but I've really tried to make the point that here was a cluster of modern human skulls, including the Cro-Magnons up here, and I also had a lot of data, which Bill Howes kindly supplied me, of modern human variation as well. So the modern humans seem to cluster here. Here were the supposed ancestors, and you can see that the Neanderthals did not fit nicely in between. In terms of their skull shape, the Neanderthals did seem to be going off in their own direction in terms of their cranial evolution. They did not seem to be ideal ancestors between these ancient forms and modern humans. And then in the 1970s, new data started to emerge about how to look at this material, and new dating evidence from Africa. So people like Desmond Clark, for example, he published this paper in the journal Man in 1975, Africa in Prehistory, Peripheral or Paramount. And Desmond answered that question as saying paramount. He argued that the new dating coming through suggested that rather than Africa being a backward place in the later stages of human evolution, with most of the action happening in the Middle East or Europe, in fact, Africa, on the new dating work, probably, rather than being backward, if anything, it was rather forward in terms of human evolution. And Bill Howes, in 1976, encapsulated the developing debate about human evolution, explaining modern man, evolutionists versus migrationists. And I think Rob Foley's right that things have changed, that in the 1970s, I think a lot of people thought there was no origin of modern humans to explain. It wasn't an evolutionary event, even. So it was not a significant problem. But Bill Howes, I think, really said, yes, there is something that needs explaining here. And did we evolve globally through evolution in each region, as Brace and Weidenreich proposed, or was there a single origin somewhere from which we spread out? And at that time, he didn't know where it was. He didn't say where it was. But he suggested these were the two models. And so that increasingly led me to think about these evolutionary models. And then we start to get suggestions that Africa, in terms of the fossil evidence, is important. Rainer Protsch published a paper in 1975, a very eccentric paper, I have to say, and even at the time I thought it was, but he said from his work on African fossils, Africa had the oldest modern humans in the world. But I have to say, even then, some of the data seemed very strange, but it was a very early out of Africa view. And I think a better argued one was Peter Beaumont and colleagues, 1978, and they took some of my PhD data and applied the new archaeological dating from Africa to suggest that indeed you had a split in the Middle Pleistocene, which in Africa, southern Africa, gave rise to modern humans, and north of the Sahara gave rise to the Neanderthals. And that's 1978. That's one of the really earliest well-articulated out of Africa views. So in the late 70s, I started to look at size and shape differences. Mike Hills, the biometrician at the Natural History Museum, helped me with this work. And it really, again, suggested there were two trends in human evolution. The Neanderthals were going in one direction of evolutionary change in the skull. Modern humans were going in another. And back to that diagram, as cladistics arose, this idea of looking at derived features and shared derived features in specimens, I started to look at my cranial data cladistically and to work out that there were indeed, clades, if you like, the modern human clade and the Neanderthal clade. And I could divide up those specimens now into categories based on their own special features and the features they shared with each other. So looking at it cladistically, and a whole range of people influenced that work, and I'm sorry I haven't got time to mention them all here. And then, well, you've seen this picture already, Günter Breuer and I in the early 1980s started to really come round to an out-of-Africa view, but at this stage it was concentrating on Africa and Europe. We were arguing strongly, yes, the modern humans in Europe, the Cro-Magnons, came out of Africa, but we were very cautious about the Far East because the data were not very clear there. We really didn't know whether the same pattern could apply in the Far East. And so increasingly I moved towards an out-of-Africa position, but still keeping very cautious about what was going on in China and Australasia. And then, of course, we get the impact of this paper, and I think we shouldn't, it did make a huge impact. The mitochondrial Eve paper, I learnt about this work in 1986, and in 1987 it was published, the work of Can, Stoneking and Wilson in Nature, where they used mitochondrial DNA to show that we appeared to have a recent African origin. Probably 200,000 years ago, all of us had this recent common origin, and the suggestion was that there must be, by implication, probably total replacement of all the other human lineages outside of Africa. And so this obviously gave Günter and me a lot more confidence in what we were arguing, that in fact maybe it could apply globally, this out-of-Africa model. And so it hit the headlines. It really did make a huge splash. The cover of Newsweek here with a medieval painting of Adam and Eve transformed into Africans, although modern Africans, we should bear in mind we're talking about Africans of 150,000 years ago. They wouldn't have looked much like that, but there we are. And then really moving on to the late 80s, we get dating evidence that showed that the moderns in the Middle East, from Shkull and Kafsay, were actually older than the Neanderthals in the region. So it sort of turned evolution on its head. In that area, there couldn't be evolution from Neanderthals to modern humans. The moderns actually were appearing there early on, perhaps from Africa. That's where their closest relatives were, as far as I could see. And Paul Mellars and I ran this meeting, which became known as the Human Revolution meeting here in Cambridge in 1987. And this was a big meeting, hugely influential, and people like Rob Foley gave a paper there about, what could be the evolutionary ecology behind the origin of modern humans in Africa. And then in 1988, I published this paper with Peter Andrews, my colleague at the Natural History Museum, where we brought together, as best we could, the fossil evidence, the genetic evidence, and the archaeological evidence for modern humans in this kind of synthesis, which we said favoured, certainly, out of Africa. And a few months ago, I went through a lot of the stuff from that time for someone who was writing a biography of Alan Wilson, the geneticist. And I went back to this paper and I dug up some of the reviews from the journal when we submitted this paper. And it's really just, I wiped it out of my mind just how abusive some of the comments were. But I've just got a few samples of what people said about this paper in print or in interviews. Impossible, unscientific, anti-evolutionary, divisive, already falsified, fatally flawed, nonsense, a great leap backward, implying a Pleistocene Holocaust. It's amazing. So, I mean, people were really threatened by this whole development of these ideas. And these were really quite exciting times, though, nevertheless. They were very exciting times. And I think just to finish them, really, the rest is history, because other people have taken up this out-of-Africa idea and developed it, and it's moved on to a whole new level. I mean, people like Günter and I were fighting just to get it established that it was even possible. And now, of course, it is the working model for modern human origins. So many people have now contributed to it, and some of you are in the audience who are there. So and just to say thank you to all these people, and especially to the Neanderthals. To my friends, where would I be without the Neanderthals? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Right. We've got half an hour for discussion, contributions, questions. I should say that there is on offer from our hosts a bottle of wine for the first 10 undergraduates who ask a question. But if I think it's a silly question, I get the bottle of wine. Right. Who wants to kick off? I'm afraid you've got to raise your hands and shout. Yes, thank you.
I wasn't going to be first, but here we go. Chris, what's your best estimate of the likely time of the first successful exit from Africa?
Of modern humans or of early humans? Modern humans. The first exit, well, obviously the Shkul and Kafse people are modern humans in Israel at 100,000 years, possibly 120,000 years on some dating. Now, some people see that as just a little extension temporarily of the African people, and then they died out. Other people say, well, they maybe did start to head eastwards. But the genetic data seem to be rather strong that it's a younger exit. 50, 60, 70,000 years based on the most recent mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome work. So in which case those Shkul Kafse people didn't go anywhere.
Okay.
If this was Harvard, I can't imagine we wouldn't have had 10 takers already. And the drinking age is 21 there, so they'd be... So come on, what's the matter with you? There's one.
Yes.
Which fossil did you enjoy finding most?
Martha, that's such a difficult question. They're all so different, and you might find one and you don't even know what it's going to be because it's in thousands of fragments and you don't think it's going to be very special. Sometimes they're just showing out of the ground, and then you excavate them and there's the complete thing. But I think really, it would be true to say that the longer it takes you to excavate them and extract them, the more exciting it is because it's kind of drawn out excitement. On the other hand, some of the better specimens sometimes can be found just like that. Let me just think about that one. Well, I think really the one I described initially when we went off on our camel safari and there was this thing sitting in. I mean, it was just too ridiculous, and we didn't even believe it was real. We thought we were dreaming, and we kind of pinched each other, and then we actually put cairns, piles of stones all over the place, and then went off to find the rest of the crew who were with us, because we thought it wouldn't be there when we got back, or we wouldn't be able to find it or something. But that was incredibly exciting because it was the first. And the first one that I found was also exciting. And then, of course, it was a Homo erectus that was in several pieces that was falling out of a cliff. And we did a huge sieving of the surface to find all the pieces. And it got better and better, which was also good. But I think really, in all... 1470, which was the skull that was found initially, just a few horrible fragments. They were very worn and weathered, and they didn't look like anything at all. And they were coming in as we were doing the screening, and they came more and more. And when we started trying to stick it together, Richard was very possessive about it. He wouldn't let me near it. And he was kind of trying to stick these bits together. It's absolutely hopeless. And I was itching to get my fingers on it, and finally he gave up. He said, okay, you'd have a try. And as more and more pieces came in, this thing became better and better. And gradually it had, almost a complete skull. It was missing a bit at the base. And then we had the face and the skull, and we couldn't fit the two together, but we could see it was a really strange looking thing because it had this long, flat face. And it was a very intriguing specimen because you just stick something together like that first of all you think, okay, is this just another boy's eye? This is nothing. Then you think, it's got rather a big skull. Maybe it isn't a boy's eye. Maybe it's a habilis. And then when the whole thing came together, it was, well, what is this thing? And we're still saying that now.
Okay, somebody over here. If you're an undergraduate, say, because then you get your wine.
I'm definitely an undergraduate. I am now. Respectively, what was the most bizarre fieldwork experience that you went through? Because I think that would be quite interesting to know.
The most bizarre fieldwork experience. I think probably when I was leading an expedition to a site called Lothringen, which is the most beautiful site. It's not huge, but it's bright red rocks, and it's surreal in a way that because these rocks are carved into all sorts of shapes. And it was a time when there was a lot of cattle rustling going on, and the Turkana people, who were the people who live in that area, were stealing cattle from the Pekot, who live further south, and vice versa. So we were a bit kind of edgy because there were these people coming through all the time, and Kamoya, who works with us, had already had a bit of a funny experience with them. And we were in this site doing a morning fieldwork, and one of the crew noticed there was a group of people walking along the top of the ridge, and you could see them silhouetted against the top of the ridge, and they were all carrying guns, and they were kind of walking there, and then they walked back again, and they walked again, and they were looking at us, and we got to feel very uneasy. And at that particular site, you had to walk, you couldn't drive out. And where we were driving out was where they were, the right way out. So we sort of felt a bit trapped. So we said, well, to hell with it, we'll just drive and see what happens. And so we actually all jumped in our cars and drove away. So nothing did actually happen. There was another fossil that, and I know this wasn't a direct question, that was found because the field crew had heard a gunshot while they were working. And one of them had a bullet whizzing past his head, and so they dived under a bush to take shelter. And I don't know why who or why shot, because they never saw the people. But under that bush was the mandible that was later made the type specimen of Homo ergaster.
Right. Two hands over there.
Are you undergraduates?
Yes.
Now, wait, before you start. What does he do? Where does he get his wine?
Well, I assume this was for us, but maybe
Right.
maybe it's for them.
It is for us.
Well, we've first got to hear the question.
Go by your own.
It's quite a broad question, but do you think that the study of biological anthropology, especially in America, will ever be able to kind of overcome the controversy, especially looking at creationism and evolution is not even taught in all schools? Do you reckon it'll ever be able to become universally accepted, or is that not going to happen?
David, do you want to take that?
No. I could elaborate. There are all sorts of reasons related to the interesting and unique political and intellectual history of the United States. I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that would happen. It's about as likely as that if you'd find that Shiites would turn into Sunnis. Sorry.
Next question.
Yeah, this is for Chris or anyone else who wants to take it. I'm an undergraduate, yeah. Do you think there is any evidence for violence between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals?
Of hybridization?
Violence.
Of violence?
Yeah.
Yes. Not any evidence we can pin down. Some Neanderthals, of course, in the time range potentially of overlap, do show some signs of injury. The Saint-Césaire Neanderthal, as you may know, has a scalp wound, which may be from an impact point of a spear, but the assumption generally is that was just another Neanderthal probably doing it. The Shanidar Neanderthal, one of them has a spear rib wound. But I think at the moment there isn't, and of course it would be very difficult to pin down the cause of an injury when you find it on a skeleton. But yes, if we ever find, let's say, a cannibalised bit of a modern human in a Neanderthal site, or the other way round, then perhaps we can start talking about that.
Over here, please. Yes. Take the microphone.
Just comment on what Chris has said. I mean, it's absolutely right what he's saying about the evidence for it, but I'd just put the thought to anybody that has there ever been a situation in human history of any kind where one population has intruded into the territory of another population, you know, hunting in the same valley, hunting the same animals at the same time, without that leading to some kind of conflict. I mean, it's not archaeological evidence, but it would be hopelessly idealistic, you know, however nice it want to be about the Neanderthals or whatever, to think that one population could come in and take over the territory of another. While I've got the microphone, can I just remind very rapidly, David, there's a lot to be said for holding the microphone, can I just remind David how he made me a multi-regionalist in about 1965, because I'd been, if I can just reminisce for just 2 seconds, I'd been taught by Charles McBurney, you know, who would never have accepted the Neanderthals in our ancestry. And that was the background I had, and I fully accepted that as I was taught by Charles, although I did write a slightly revolutionary essay about the Chattopronian in my second year, I think. But then when you came, I was a PhD student, and even though you're, as far as I can tell, about a year younger than me, you're already a junior lecturer here, and I was very influenced by your views, and we talked a lot together in the old Haddon Library. But it was the time when Loring Brace had just brought out that amazing paper, The Fate of the Classic Neanderthals, and we were all immensely impressed by that paper. I mean, this was the 60s, you know, and it was propagating an idea of simple evolution. We were all impressed by it, and I think you and I have to confess, in view of what I've said to some of the students, at one stage I was a multi-regionalist. And then, through the influence of Chris Stringer's work and other people, I turned back again. So I've done 2 U-turns on this, and now, of course, I'm a firm out-of-Africa person. But I think we should admit that, you know, we all have multi-regional phases in our own evolution. Is that a fair comment?
Maybe not all of us. Some of us.
Confession time. Okay. Over here, just a few rows back.
This is kind of to everybody, and it's just, is there anything kind of associated with your name or anything you've written that you really, really now regret?
Right.
You're talking about an academic publication, are you, or something else? I might have written some letters I regret. But
Yes, we should probably keep it in the academic sphere for now.
Yes, Leslie.
Okay, wait. Not so much that I regret, but it's the fate of what happens to what you write. And apparently I was featured quite strongly in the California Cattleman magazine by saying that everybody should eat meat.
Thank you. There's a gentleman. You've got the microphone, yes.
I'd just like to follow up on what Paul Mayers said, because it seemed to me he was pointing out there something that affects this science a great deal, which is seduction by the way a subject is presented rather than by the evidence. Do you have anything to say about that, I wonder?
Well, do you think this is particular to paleoanthropology?
To the science, yes.
Really? All right.
That David puts the case very well, and Paul is convinced. It doesn't seem to me to be directly related to the evidence.
I think that's not an unfair statement. I think it's quite different now, and it's related to density of evidence and the sort of an order of magnitude larger number of competent people who have to be listened to and have to listen, and should, but have to listen to each other. So I think it's related to density of evidence and number of people involved. There are clearly still minds that will be changing, say, 10 years from now.
I noticed that Chris didn't mention Walcott.
Well, he only had 15 minutes, but...
So I wonder if that means that I shouldn't bother about Walcott.
you mean, sorry, when you say you shouldn't bother, you mean not read anything he writes anymore? Or What do you mean by that? Not bother about?
Well, this again comes back to this question of seduction, the point that I was making now. I mean, there's so much written in the opposing views.
Yes.
It seems to me that the back and forth that you have to refer to the papers that went back there and went back there, that it goes on. And at some point it seems to me that the people who are writing this perhaps ought to sit back and say, why are we having this discussion? What are we lacking that prevents us from actually coming to a decision on the issue?
I think
before you start, I think if we could just quickly sketch what we're talking about, because I think a lot of people in the audience won't have caught the references to who this gentleman is and what it's all about.
Okay, Milford Wolpoff is a very strong proponent still of the multi-regional model of modern human origins, that modern humans evolved globally through from more ancient forms. And so, out of Africa, certainly the way he presented 20 years ago, Africa was not in any way particularly important. It was part of human evolution, modern human evolution, but not especially important. And Milford's views were very strongly put, and he was very influential. And he had a number of PhD students who followed that viewpoint. And I think it partly relates to what Rob was saying about how the field has grown. In the 1980s, there actually weren't many of us working on modern human origins, because a lot of people, there were all these wonderful fossils from Africa, much older. There were much sexier things to be working on, if I could put it that way, than modern human origins. So I think the fact there were fewer of us meant that the ones who there were, had perhaps a greater effect. People like Milford, as I say, he went to a lot of conferences, he presented his views very forcefully. So yes, he did have you could say, perhaps a too great an influence on the way things went. But now it is different, because there are so many more people working in the field, and we've got so much more data from archaeology, from dating, from genetics, from the fossils. The fossils on their own are not on their own enough, perhaps we recognise, to really solve all these problems. We need all of this extra data, and I think that's why no single person could come in now and dominate things in that way, as Milford did for a while.
I think that's an extremely tactful answer. I should say that
yes,
my last act as editor of Current Anthropology was to write to Chris and say, for heaven's sake, where is this response to Wolpoff that you've been writing? I want to put it in before I go back. And the thing came under the wire the last day that I was there. And it was very forcefully put. But I published it, and I think that I did right at the time. I was on the right side, because there's one of these arguments which was absolutely resolved, and today nobody has any doubt that Chris Stringer was right. Right. Right hand, lady in front. Somebody got a microphone?
David Pilbeam once wrote a paper about the soft evidence. We've heard nothing tonight about the soft evidence. Do any of you feel that our naked, fat-lined skin might be a clue to anything?
Leslie, do you want to take that to start?
This isn't a modern human origins question, I believe.
Leslie, you have the first go.
For those of you in the audience who don't know the source of the question, this is Elaine Morgan, who is very well known for the aquatic hypothesis for human evolution. And I think that the evolution of soft skin, of naked skin, is still pretty much up in the air. There's been some very interesting genetic information that's come out arguing that it might be relatively late in the fossil record. But my own feeling about it is that it is a savanna adaptation or an open country adaptation, and it is related to thermoregulation during high levels of activity. But some of my colleagues here might have different opinions.
Okay, there's a lady at the back there.
This is for all the speakers. I was wondering what you consider the next big question, the next controversy in the field.
That's a very good one. I'm going to go right along the panel on that. Chris?
Well, from my point of view, I think, okay, if we accept we had a recent African origin for modern humans, why? Yeah, what actually produced the modern humans in Africa? I don't think we know why.
Meave.
Well, yes, and I think that also applies with Homo erectus and the extinction of the other species of Homo. Why? And we just don't know, and I think we really need more skeletons to tell us. So there's a lot still to be found, and I think it's really good to think about how much evidence we actually have. I mean, we're sampling. I think Andrew Hill at one point figured out, and I don't know how he did it, but he figured out that the fossil sites in Africa mean we're sampling 1% of the continent's area, in the actual area where there are fossil sites. And within those fossil sites, which are divided in different time intervals, we're sampling a minute fraction of what lived there. And so sometimes quite good to think, okay, there's a lot still to be found, and not to say, okay, we've got all the answers, because the story of our past is really fascinating and it's really complex. And so I think we ask the questions, and our questions are based on what we have already found. If we haven't found something, there's a whole lot of more questions out there, which are, 10 years from now, goodness knows what everybody's going to be asking, or what we're going to have
Thank you. Leslie?
Okay, following on from what Meave said, and what we don't know, Floresiensis was a big wake-up call, that there may be an awful lot more going on than we appreciate right now. But what I've been impressed with is we've paid very little attention to the 4 million years of human evolution before Homo erectus. And were these Australopithecines and Australopithecine-like things just bipedal apes? Were they really important for human evolution, or was the real main first revolution with humans the appearance of Homo erectus, the long legs, the expanding brain? And if we follow this type of logic through, and also realize what might be there across all of Eastern Asia, that's almost invisible to us now in terms of significance to human evolution. There's many exciting things out there. And I used to tell my students that I never gave the same lectures twice. And I've taught human evolution every year since 1970, up until 3 years ago. And there's no reason to think that it's not going to continue like that and just ratchet up. It's going to be a very exciting next few decades.
You say that reminds me of something David said in 1979 at the American Association of Physical Anthropology meetings. So many people were crowded into a room to hear you talk on Schewapithecus. They said, okay, he's agreed to come back in 3 hours and give it again. And you said, well, actually, I may have changed my mind by the time.
David?
I was always too facile, so I'll take that back. Well, I agree with all of the above. One of my favourites is my continued lifetime obsession, which is hominid origins, and particularly the origins of bipedalism. I think we are closer to being able to imagine, or even in some indirect way to do experiments, to understand how one could change genetic programs so that one could change a chimpanzee-like quadruped into an upright biped. There are lots of good ideas out there as to what were the selection pressures like that produced this shift. What were the intermediate stages like? How can we imagine? It's almost as though you have to be a good novelist to imagine this transitional period. So for me, that's as challenging as the out of Africa or origins of Erectus or some of the other things, and it's as fascinating. It's fascinating for me because to complete the story, again, you need to come at it from so many different directions.
Rob, do you want to add something?
Why not? I think one of the things one should remember is that people who study human evolution are very reluctant to admit what they don't know, because they say they don't know something and the next minute it's on every creationist website saying, evolutionists admit they don't understand human evolution. So one has to be cautious. I think I'll just give two very brief objections. Now, you asked, what's the most likely great controversy? My guess is that the areas where we're going to see the most controversy are going to be in recent human evolution and the evolution from the beginnings of Homo sapiens to the diversity we see today. Why? Because it's clearly closely related to what we're most interested in, and also it's an area where a battery of new approaches, genetics, development, evolution and development, are beginning to have an effect. So my guess is that's the most controversial area where there'll be discussions. I think the area we know the least about is the one Meave mentioned at the very beginning, which is the origins of our own genus, Homo. I mean, I think that remains a big mystery, but don't quote me on that.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very, very good note on which to bring proceedings to a close. I'd like to thank the Leverhulme Centre for Human Evolutionary Studies for hosting this event. I very much want to thank Pamela Smith, who was most absolutely brilliant and efficient and well-organized coordinator of all activities and brought us all together. This couldn't have happened without her. I know she wants me to really thank all the volunteers who've helped so willingly with the tea and with other arrangements so far today. But above all, I want to thank the panelists, who I think have given us a most fascinating and entertaining evening. Thank you very much indeed.